Welcome to the Commentary Magazine Daily Podcast. Today is Tuesday, June 11th, 2024. I am John Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary Magazine, with a brief note that tomorrow and Thursday are the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, so we will not be podcasting Wednesday or Thursday of this week. We'll be back on Friday, having celebrated the gift of the Torah to Moses at Sinai and having eaten a lot of cheesecake, which for some reason is the minhag, as we say, the sort of local custom of Americans is to eat cheesecake on Shavuot. And maybe Seth or Mayor Soloveitchik could explain to us why, but whatever is the case, it's a dairy holiday, so we will be full of lactose intolerance when we return on Friday. With me today, however, is executive editor Abe Greenwald. Hi, Abe.
Hi, John.
Senior editor Seth Mandel. Hi, Seth.
Hi, John. And I do not like cheesecake, and I don't eat it.
Well, then you're going to have a blintz.
I was just going to say, you're a
like
blintz
that.
man.
Okay. And that, of course, was media commentary columnist Christine Rosen. Hi, Christine.
Hi, John. I'm Team Cheesecake.
And joining us today, always a pleasure, our tech commentary columnist, media veteran, and all-around wise, sage analyst of things PC and not PC, James B. Meggs. Hi, Jim.
Hi, John. Nice to be back.
So, Jim, we're going to talk about what happened with Anthony Fauci last week or the week before last in front of the Committee on Capitol Hill, which is the subject of your upcoming commentary piece, which we call the Fauci Conspiracy, which I think to our count is the 11th. Is that right? The 11th?
Or 12th. Yeah, it's up there.
The 11th or 12th piece that you have dedicated in your monthly column to COVID and the COVID fallout since March of 2020. So that's sort of 4 years. That's about a quarter of the pieces that you've written for commentary have been dedicated to COVID. And I proposed the other week to you that we might want to figure out some way of assembling them into a book that could almost follow over time the development of the sense that we all started to get that what the story, the official story that we were being handed, the behavior that was being imposed upon us, and the moral imposition of behaviors that we were told if we did not abide by them would not only make us bad people for being so selfish and uncommunitarian, but would also murder thousands of other people through our inaction. How that consensus slowly began to fray, even in the course of the early months of 2020. And then really the bottom started coming out of it as we learned more and more about the transmission of the disease and who was getting it and what it meant that we had a pandemic that for the first time in history was sparing small children as opposed to nailing small children the way most epidemic diseases do. Ending in this scene before the House with Anthony Fauci present, in which at least a couple of very, very, very expert observers who know everything there is to know about COVID are firmly convinced that he committed actionable perjury before the House as a sworn witness. You quote at least one person saying this, and that has not to do with him saying we should be 6 feet apart or whatever. It has to do with the cover-up of the role that he may have played in two matters. One is, was American money going to the Wuhan lab to pursue gain of function efforts that had already been abjured, or I don't know what the word, sort of had already been ruled out of bounds by U.S. government regulations in 2017 and 2018? And did he then participate in the drafting of an article that said that there was no way that this transmission was anything but natural, that he knew to be false, or that he knew at least was not false, but that he had no reason to believe was true? And that these two, the way he testified on this, suggests deliberate deceit and lying before a congressional committee.
Yeah, I mean, I've been covering various aspects of this since the first year of the pandemic. And, if there's a theme to this progression of pieces here and also some stuff I've written in City Journal, it's Abe's mantra, but it's worse than that. I think, like most people, I started out being sympathetic to the idea of 2 weeks to stop the spread and people staying home and for a little while to reduce transmission and reduce the load on hospitals. But then I became skeptical pretty early on when I saw that they weren't grappling with. First, there was the issue of how COVID travels, whether it travels like influenza, mostly through touch and droplets, or whether it's airborne like measles. And one of the first deceptions on the part of the public health officials was they just didn't want to admit that it looked like it was airborne. And there was all this early evidence. Scientists were begging them to look into this. So one of the kind of funny things that came out in Fauci's hearing that wasn't the cover up of a potential lab leak or anything as bad as that, but that 6 feet apart rule that we were all supposed to live by was pretty much just pulled out of thin air. So I got skeptical about that. And then towards the end of 2020, when people started really looking into the lab leak question, I was really struck with how concerted the effort was, not just to say, no, we don't think it's a lab leak and argue about it, but to suppress the argument, not even to be willing to have the discussion. And that was a pattern that, now that we look back, that our public health officials, very much led by Fauci, applied to almost every aspect of the pandemic, where they had a policy or they had an interpretation of the facts that they wanted to make official, and they would not tolerate any discussion, any debate, any conversation. And so looking back, it's really quite chilling how much at odds the way they used their power was very much at odds with what we think of as the traditions of a free democratic nation. So the longer I've worked on this topic, the more dismayed I've been with the abuse of power on the part of our public health officials. And I think that for a lot of the public, whether you're following this really closely and you follow the lab leak debate, or you're just kind of picking up bits and pieces as you go along, the sense of outrage, the sense of being betrayed by our public officials is going to linger. It's going to reverberate in our politics for many years to come.
They were also, of course, aided and abetted enthusiastically by mainstream media that itself actively suppressed any alternative views. I mean, I recall when some of those Fauci emails were leaked in, I think it was like 2021, the New York Times immediately gave space to one of the virologists who was on the Fauci team to argue, no, this is just literally to say this is the scientific method in action. We looked at something, we decided it wasn't scientific, and we moved on to a new idea, which is, of course, not at all what happened. They actively suppressed the competing idea from the very beginning. We now know this. But again, I think to the trust issue, which is the most important, and Jim, all of your pieces have really pointed out how important this is, particularly with regard to public health. When the media wants to look at all us rubes who are questioning, the CDC now, they should look at themselves as well, because I think this is why people become almost conspiratorial in their concern about what they're taught, because the public needs a source of information it can rely on, and they turn to conspiracy when the regular sources of information prove themselves to be, well, in this case, liars.
Fauci said something very interesting in the course of the hearing. He said that he didn't know where the idea that we should create 6 feet of distance was between people, and he didn't know where it came from. And of course, that was the hinge of all social shutdown in the United States. That's why schools were shut down. That's why businesses were shut down. Was this assertion that the distance between human beings needed to be 6 feet in order to prevent transmission. And he said he wasn't sure where it came from. And then that rang alarm bells with me, not because it's, of course, horrible to hear that the person who is the head of the National Institute for Infectious Diseases was part of a regime that imposed this social distancing on people that has had unbelievably parlous consequences on American society even now. and that he didn't know where it came from. But I did. I know where it came from because I read a book. See, I read a book, and he knows where it came from too, and that's why he's lying. Michael Lewis's The Premonition, which came out in 2022, is a fascinating document because it is a description of a team of people within the government, classic Michael Lewis setup, for unconventional thinkers who nobody would listen to, who come together in a secret, in a sort of together because they're people of vision, and they're being blocked by bureaucracies, and they set up rules and policies, and then they know the truth and everybody else didn't know the truth. So in 2006, I just looked this up. So a couple of guys who came together, one in the White House, because George W. Bush had read a book about the Spanish flu and had said, we need to prepare for a possible pandemic in the future. Look how we had no preparation. So they're literally, I just want to read a little bit from this, okay? So they, somebody did a graph, a guy named Bob Glass pulled out a graph about what life would be like. There were crude strategies. This is what Michael Lewis says: isolating the ill, quarantining entire households, socially distancing adults, giving people antiviral drugs, and so on. Each of the crude strategies had some slight effect, but none by itself made much of a dent. And certainly none had the ability to halt a pandemic by driving the disease's reproductive rate below 1. Forget what that means. One intervention was not like the others, however. When you closed schools and put social distance between kids, the flu-like disease fell off a cliff. The model defined social distance not as zero contact, but as a 60% reduction in kids' social interaction. I said, holy S, said Carter. Nothing big happens until you close the schools. It's not like anything else. It's like a phase change. It's nonlinear. It's like when water temperature goes from 33 to 32. When it goes from 34 to 33, it's no big deal. 1 degree colder, and it turns to ice. This is 2006. The entire policy of the United States government was based on guys in 2006 having been playing around with a model that said, close schools and you end a pandemic. Then the disease comes along that they then apply this model to, and it doesn't kill children at all. The number of deaths from COVID remains below 2,000 since the onset in the United States, since the onset of the disease in 2020. It didn't kill kids. We knew that it wasn't killing kids about 3 months into the pandemic because people were dying except kids. And then they pull this off the shelf thing. So how do I know about it? From a best-selling book that was written by America's most popular nonfiction writer. So what the hell is Fauci talking about? He doesn't know where it came from. It came from a model that somebody designed 15 years earlier that was not applicable to the condition that we were actually facing in the real world when the time came to implement anti-pandemic policies. So why did they do it? And why is he lying about it now? He's lying about it now because it was wrong. And he's lying about it now because he wants to say, it ain't me, Jack. I don't know. I mean, it just sort of came out of nowhere. It didn't come out of nowhere. He knows where it came out of. He advocated it. Everyone in public health advocated it. They ruined 2 years of childhood education. They created a mental health crisis among America's youth. They did it. And we're not now even talking about the stuff that he perjured himself about. I mean, I suppose you could call that perjury, but you can never prove whether somebody knew or didn't know something. Unless, we found a copy of The Premonition dog-eared on his desk with lines underlined that, somehow was, subpoenaed by the House committee. So that was one, amazing moment for me. It's like, what are you kidding me? What do you mean you don't know where it came from? Michael Lewis knows where it came from, and he supported it. That's why this book is a fascinating read now, because if you want to read why everything went wrong, read the story of how these 4 people designed the pandemic policies that we implemented, and they were wrong about everything. And this is a book that presumes that they were right. So it's almost like reading the people who thought that the world was going to come to an end in 2012, and they were up on what were the paradise? What was that cult called? And then they wrote a book in 2013 about how they were right that the world was going to end in 2012 while they were standing on the mountaintop.
Yeah, it's the combination of suppressing opposing ideas. It's the lying combined with the bumbling that makes people generally say, "Oh, I don't trust them." Not only do I not trust that they're telling us the truth, but I don't trust that they know what they're doing. If you look at something like, what about the whole herd immunity concept, right? That we were going with for so long, that just evaporated because it wasn't operative. It didn't make any sense.
The thing about the thing about the 6 foot distance was that that always got me was that Raquel Walensky was brought in to direct the CDC, and she had spent time at Harvard and Massachusetts General, I think was it, let me see. She was, Massachusetts General Hospital. And she said in July 2020, there's an email from her where she says, if people are masked, it is quite safe and much more practical to be at 3 feet in many school settings. So it was 2020. And then
she apologized.
Then they brought her in.
Then they had a meeting. Yes.
Right. They hired her after that in the federal government to run the CDC, and she endorsed 6 feet.
She endorsed 6 feet after a meeting at the White House with Randy Weingarten,
the head
of the teachers union. And they had a meeting, and they had a come to Jesus meeting where Randy Weingarten said, "You're going to murder millions of teachers." And she came out and said, 6 feet, close schools for a year. This is the only thing to do. And Jim, but in a larger sense, and now pushing a libertarian button, what we saw here was the elevation of the politicians who wanted to use emergency fiat power to control the economies of their states, the retail of their states, and the populations of their states, and the demonization of the politicians who did not wish to do so. So Cuomo up, Brian Kemp down, right? Phil Murphy of New Jersey up, Ron DeSantis down. Gavin Newsom up until it was found out that he was going and eating fancy dinners at the French Laundry, and Greg Abbott down. Like, this was the way that this worked. The idea was what we wanted were authoritarian Democrats to tell us what to do. And if you didn't do what they told you, you were bad and they were good, and you were a monster and they weren't. And as the Atlantic said, Amanda Mull in the Atlantic said, Brian Kemp is testing out the limits of child sacrifice.
Human sacrifice. An experiment in human sacrifice was the headline.
Georgia. Yes. This was, and that is the most prestigious magazine owned by a billionaire's wife that we've ever seen. Billionaire's widow, excuse me.
It's all too typical. It's funny. The Atlantic had a mix of some very good coverage, David Zweig and others, and some really terrible coverage. But that was one for the ages. And part of what we saw was how reflexive the urge among Democrats was to just take control of everything. Gretchen Whitmer, famous example, they wanted to shut the stores down, but they had to allow people to get certain key supplies. So, in big box stores, it was like, well, these aisles have to remain closed, but these, the aisle where you buy paper towels is open, but the aisle where you buy gardening supplies is closed. And, in New York, it's like, well, you can serve beer if you're a restaurant that also serves food. All these little fussy rules that are kind of laughable now, except that they took for granted it was their role to boss people around. But then if you look at the CDC's rule to extend, they had this idea that if people got evicted for non-payment of rent, that would somehow be a health emergency. And first Congress passed some requirement to that effect, but it was temporary. When it expired, the Biden administration wanted to continue it. And to me, there was nothing in the CDC's charter to suggest that they should have regulatory power over rental arrangements in the U.S. It was absolutely ridiculous, but it was the don't let a crisis go to waste idea. It's like, well, this is a good idea. All our progressive friends think rents are too high anyway, and people should never be evicted. So why don't we just impose this as part of our COVID regulatory what they wouldn't call it overreach, but of course it was. There were so many examples of that, and a lot of them weren't even barely controversial or barely covered in the press, which was all in to support this kind of change in our relationship with government.
Abe, you wrote a piece in 2022 called "The Trust Crisis" that evoked this and various other matters. I mean, it seems now from this perspective that we had a trust crisis in 2020 with Trump, right? Americans ceased to trust that Trump was a steady hand on the tiller, if they ever did. But I mean, enough Americans who had thought so or were willing to have his hand on the tiller then said, I don't trust him anymore. And I think if you look back from a 30,000-foot perspective, you see Trump, the supposed authoritarian monster who wants to end democracy in our time, was extremely uncomfortable with asserting prerogatives over the behavior of private business, and that he was being urged to do so by everyone around him, by every public health official around him, and by this consensus in the media. And he didn't really want to do it. And I'm not sure he knew why he didn't want to do it, because he's not a systematic thinker, but there was something in him. I think it was maybe like, well, if I were, building a building and they made me have all my, steel layers 6 feet apart, that wouldn't work. I don't really know, but
he spoke about the economy a lot in terms of this. In this regard, saying, he was always saying we can't keep we can't keep everything shut down forever. There's going to be no country left to come back to. Was his line. Yeah.
Right. So, but I'm just saying that it's interesting because the people who think that what Trump wants to do is turn America into an authoritarian dictatorship supported these mini authoritarian dictatorships. And I don't use that term lightly. What Andrew Cuomo did in New York State was authoritarian. There was some point at which he was thinking of closing the borders of New York State to states that didn't have the same draconian policies that he did, until somebody explained that in the United States, you're not allowed to close the border. He doesn't own the border. New York State barely even has a border. It has a border for tax purposes and census allotment. It doesn't have a border. They're not borders. And he was picking and choosing. He said, if you serve a pretzel, you can have 35% capacity in your bar. But if you don't serve a pretzel, you can't have 35% capacity. Whatever. He was just picking and choosing and making rules. And
bars closed at 10 p.m. at night because that's when the virus went to sleep.
Right.
Well, I'm sorry. You also must name check the Cuomo map. Remember the New York tough map with its, all its different layers decoding the various symbols? Yes.
Oh, right. So anyway, So I'm just saying that we had this interest. We have this weird projection moment at which we have Democrats running in 2024 on the threats to democracy from the authoritarian Trump, on the part of people who supported authoritarian measures without much ambiguity from 2020 until the middle, let's say the middle of 2021, including, by the way, the notion that vaccination, which is an arguable thing, by the way, this is a weird thing, but like that vaccination needed to be mandatory, that it was okay to suspend all hiring and firing rules in the United States based on employment status if someone were or were not getting the mRNA vaccine. Actors, soap opera actors, people all over the place were getting fired because they said they didn't want to take a vaccine, which by definition, in the way we understand healthcare in the United States, has to be voluntary. It has to be voluntary because we cannot impose health demands on people that way. It's who are over the age of 18. It's actually a violation of their privacy. There are federal laws guaranteeing your privacy. So do you have to display that you've been vaccinated? That's a violation under most understandings. That would be a violation of HIPAA rules. That in order to go into someplace, you have to show that you had had a medical treatment. But here we were. All rules were suspended.
We haven't had a like a deep dive COVID discussion in a long time, so it's weird. It's coming back to me, the sort of mood of it. And to my mind, what strikes me is that we're not over it in so many ways. I mean, I don't mean individually. I mean, it has left seemingly permanent marks on our culture, on our society, structurally. I mean, even like all those like dumpy or sometimes not so dumpy outdoor seating areas in restaurants around the city. They're still out there, and they're bad, by the way. Like they block up the streets, and they're rat infested now, and they're a mess. But also, I mean, the lockdown, the extended lockdown, without that, we wouldn't have seen the kind of rioting and looting that we saw after George Floyd was killed. We wouldn't have seen the COVID New York subway disaster. There are still lingering effects of that, and the change in our manners from that time, when we stopped dealing with one another on a regular basis and interacting and seeing each other's faces. It's all still it's left this mark. We're not functioning the way we did in 2019. We're just not. It's a imitation of how we were functioning in 2019, but with certain limitations now on us.
Can I get a little personal here? So I have 3 kids. My oldest, by the way, turns 20 today. So happy birthday, Shayna. She's 20. I have a 17-year-old, and I have a 13-year-old about to turn 14. So each of them affected by COVID at different stages of their lives 4 years ago, right? Shayna was 16. My daughter Shiri was 13. Isaac, my son, was 9. Ask anyone who has a 13-year-old today who had older children what those 13-year-olds are like compared to what the 13-year-olds were like who were 6 or 7 years older. I'm not just talking about my son, who was a wonderful boy and is very polite, and I'm very happy with him, and he does his work, and I'm saying in aggregate, like their classrooms or whatever. Everyone will tell you that they are socially retarded, and I mean retarded in the literal sense of the word retarded. I'm not using it in insultingly. They seem 1 or 2 years younger than they were because they spent a year and a half having no social interactions with each other except over Zoom or phones or playing video games or on Discord chats or whatever. Everybody knows this. Now, is this going to have lingering consequences? People have been through wars. People have gone to concentration camp. But New York strong. Everyone can be strong. But that right there, right? That's 8 million. Let's just say that's 8 million kids between the ages of, 12 and 14 whose maturation was interfered with consequences that I assume people who are people of goodwill will be studying for decades to see, when they achieve homeostasis, what really mattered. Did it have a trust effect or a whatever kind of effect on them that's lingering or not? I suppose probably chances are it really won't, because people have lived through worse and all of that. But it's a real thing. Like and this was nationwide. I mean, there are states where it was better or worse. But
Well, that's a point we shouldn't gloss over, and it is a source of a lot of the frustration of people who are looking back now, as Abe says, and kind of remembering when Fauci's in the news again, for example, what happened to their families during this time. Because in some states, the kids were back at school pretty quickly. In some countries overseas, they never had to leave school, and they were fine. So these were political choices that were given a gloss of a public health emergency in some cases, and local officials made terrible decisions. Remember the shutting down of all the playgrounds for no apparent reason, chaining them up so kids couldn't go play, filling in
pools,
yes, sand in the skate park. I mean, all of these were political choices, but they used public health as the message, and they knew people were fearful so that they could get away with it. And even if you want to assume they had the best of intentions, as soon as it was clear that this was harmful, they should have rolled those back, and they did not. They chose.
By the way, just one last point. My kids were in school. My kids' school.
Mine were out for a year and many months.
Okay, yours were, but like my kids, except for spring of 2020, my kids were back in the two schools that they were attending at the time. But they were in schools masked, and they were in schools 6 feet apart. So they were walking down hallways along the walls and then making left turns to get. They couldn't cross a hallway from one room to the other. There was a protocol where they were marching like, Alec Guinness's men in the bridge of the River Kwai, in sort of weird formations in order to maintain the discipline of 6 feet. And they couldn't hear their teachers because everybody was masked and their teachers couldn't hear them. So, and that was good. That was the good thing. That was the people who were in school. Those were the kids who were in school. Anyway.
I just want to say there's also one other, I think, very real way that this has stayed with us that's worth talking about, which is that when public health officials came out and said, yes, it's very bad to gather in public, you will kill people, unless you are rioting for Black Lives Matter. That's good, that's safe, that's important, because that's an equal public health threat, systemic racism. That institutional elevation of social justice activism and writing, I think, has played a real fundamental role in laying the groundwork for what we're seeing today, what we've seen on campuses, the pro-Hamas mobs and the administrations that just go with it. That when public health officials decided that social justice tops all is the chief concern for health in America. That was a big shift and gave a big pass to everyone.
And that was also like that point is a really important one because it highlighted, I think, Abe, the fact that the officials making these rules and enforcing them didn't fully believe that they were necessary, right? So we mentioned earlier, Rochelle Walensky saying, 3 feet is fine in school, and then, sort of disavowing it when we knew that she had said that, right? Like it wasn't discovered later. We knew that she thought 3 feet was fine, and she was still insisting 6. There was this idea that, we knew that they knew that this was all kind of theater in a way, and then it was used to justify certain kinds of like violence and anarchy, and that's when people got really mad. But I one of the things that I really that I really caught my attention during the COVID stuff was the extent to which these officials who didn't really believe what they were saying were looking for an excuse to lighten up in some areas, and sending out these sort of test balloons to see whether the Twitter reaction and the activist response would eat them alive if they said these things. And the biggest indicator of that was the fact that for a pretty long period, the New York Times, David Leonhardt, was essentially the shadow CDC director. And David Leonhardt has this, he has this newsletter. And during COVID, he devoted much of it to COVID. And it provoked a lot of debate. The New York Times was getting letters. Politico did a story about how the New York Times was constantly getting letters from both sides of the debate from doctors all around the country and even the world saying, you can't let David Leonhardt write this, or thanks for letting David Leonhardt write this. Like, behind closed doors, there was this debate that wasn't allowed in the public. But the main thing was, is David Leonhardt of the New York Times, does he have the space to the credibility on the left to say maybe we shouldn't be doing this? And can then officials say that? And it was like, David, you be the guy, when the sea split, it was because somebody went into the Red Sea and it split because he showed faith, right? When he went into the Red Sea, it wasn't just like waving a staff. It was like, you be the guy who jumps into the Red Sea. And if it splits, we'll follow you to freedom, David Leonhardt. And that was how people in the administration and in the bureaucracy seemed to behave. Like, if David Leonhardt does this and doesn't die, isn't swallowed by the sea, then we'll follow him. And that sort of said to me that they were just desperate for that it was like how we sometimes say Twitter is the real editor of the New York Times, how these articles get canceled and people get fired because of Twitter backlash. It felt like that during COVID. It felt like how public health rules and national rules and laws that were designed to stop a pandemic were actually about whether there would be backlash on Twitter.
Right. Okay. I want to go deeper into that, and then deeper into this question of whether Fauci actually committed crimes last week. But first, let me talk to you about our friends at Shopify, because creating really great retail experiences is tough, especially with multiple stores, teams of staff, fulfillment centers, separate workflows. It's a lot, but with Shopify Point of Sale, you can do it all without complexity. Its point of sale system is a unified command center for your retail business. It brings together in-store and online operations, even across 1,000 locations. Imagine being able to guarantee that shopping is always convenient. Endless aisle, ship to customer, buy online, pick up in store, all made simpler so that customers can shop how and where they want, and staff have the tools they need to close the sale every time. So want more? Check out shopify.com/commentary, all lowercase commentary, by the way, and learn how to create the best retail experience without complexity. That's shopify.com/commentary, lowercase commentary. So, Jim, Fauci, two issues, right? One, gain of function. Two, I've now already forgotten what two is. The two things that he may have perjured himself for. The article. Funding for gain of function, and then the lies about the piece that he helped gin up to deny the lab leak, which are connected.
Right. So they're connected. So a lot of people have heard, and I've written many times about this mysterious meeting on February 1st. Now, remember, this is before COVID had really hit. 2020 had really hit the U.S., and a bunch of virologists immediately were kind of freaked out that this virus was emerging in Wuhan, which had the #1 lab in the world for studying coronaviruses that are derived from bats, which this virus looked very similar to. So there was an immediate suspicion that it might have leaked out of the lab, and a lot of these scientists knew that they and their colleagues had worked with the team at the Wuhan Institute. So this was a real concern. They started arguing against what they called a conspiracy theory that this was a lab leak before this was a widespread view anywhere. Before most conservatives, or before Trump had ever mentioned the possibility of a lab leak, Fauci was organizing his troops to suppress the idea, to dismiss it as a crazy right-wing fantasy. And they did more than that. They organized this famous short article called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, and that didn't just say, we don't know where it came from, there's no evidence it came from a lab. It said very strongly, we don't think there's any possibility of a lab leak. When Fauci was asked about that last week, he downplayed his role in organizing that article over the time since that article came out. Sometimes he pretends like he doesn't really know who wrote it. Just some scientists wrote it. He was emailing these guys every day and pushing them to make the article more definitive, to make it more like it was an open and shut case, that it did not come from a lab. He knew all of these people well, but he'd be like, "Oh, there was this article that some scientists did. I kind of forget who they are." And then in the hearing the other day, he again downplayed his role in creating that piece, that article. Then the other thing that he has been dishonest about is his agency's long-standing role in funding research in Wuhan, including a study, I believe it was in 2016, that anybody who follows this kind of virology research says was clearly gain-of-function research. Now, this was not gain-of-function research on a virus that could be seen as a precursor.
We should explain really quickly. Gain-of-function means you take something and you strengthen it, you make it more toxic or more viral, more dangerous in order to see how you kill it. Like that's
basically,
you add function to a virus to see how to kill it better.
Gain-of-function is the beginning of every horror movie.
Yeah. So they collect viruses in the wild. They knew that these bat viruses were potentially dangerous. So they had a team that was partially funded by the U.S. to go and collect bat viruses in all these caves in southern China. We're talking like 1,000 kilometers from Wuhan, which is another reason that the wet market theory is, I think, very, very dubious. These animals didn't live anywhere near Wuhan. The bats didn't live anywhere near Wuhan. They collected these viruses, brought them back to the lab, and then they said, well, what if these viruses naturally evolve this way or that way? Could they become more dangerous? And so they will say that they're just doing in the lab what nature will probably do anyway, and then they can see which ones get dangerous, and then in theory they could make a vaccine against it. We could be prepared if this natural evolution takes place. Well, Richard E. Bright at Rutgers University, who I often quote in my pieces, he's always called this approach to virus research, it's like looking for a gas leak with a lighted match. You're basically taking this thing that might get dangerous, making it more dangerous, and then assuming that all your protocols in your lab are so airtight, so seamless, that there's no way this virus could ever leak out, when in fact these virus labs have a terrible history of bad security. People get infected, animals can escape. I mean, all kinds of things can happen. And so we know that the U.S. was funding this research. And then to really get into the weeds, we know that the major conduit for this research funding, a New York nonprofit called the EcoHealth Alliance, that in 2017, they proposed a particular gain-of-function project with a particular coronavirus that involved manipulating the spike protein that helps it enter the human cells, especially in lung tissue. And it's called a furin cleavage site. A lot of people have seen this phrase. They proposed inserting that into the spike on this virus. The research in the end didn't get funded, but the very fact that they were discussing this project with their colleagues in Wuhan, the very fact that they were really intending and appearing to sort of downplay or hide the fact that a lot of this research would happen in Wuhan, and then this very kind of virus emerged 2 years later from Wuhan, suggests to many observers that this research did happen, maybe not funded by the U.S. Maybe it was already underway at the time this research proposal was put together, which isn't uncommon in scientific research. At any rate, this on a virus that fits this exact description emerged in Wuhan. less than 2 years later. So did the U.S. directly fund that? Maybe not. But all these scientists, all these researchers who were hip deep working with their colleagues in Wuhan, they never stepped forward. They never said, oh, yeah, we know about this proposal. We know about this work. We know about that work. We know that they actually in Wuhan work at much lower biosafety levels than we would here in the U.S. They knew all this stuff. They knew they'd had a history of funding this stuff. I think to some degree they helped train the Wuhan scientists in some of these cutting edge techniques, and so that they could be partners in more research. They didn't tell us any of this. They pretended like they barely knew what Wuhan was. They downplayed stuff. They tried to sidestep Freedom of Information Act requests. This long history of trying to distract people, trying to hide their involvement. And then in a lot of cases, what we haven't really gotten to today is trying to censor public discussion of this and many other issues. Fauci and others were leaning on U.S. intelligence agencies and others. Then the White House was leaning on the social media companies to define any discussion of any of these issues as disinformation, misinformation. So it forms a pattern which is absolutely chilling when it comes to our understanding of what our relationship with our government should be. That they were hiding some potentially really bad stuff. We don't know for sure that the U.S. is responsible for this, but why were they hiding it? Why were they going so far out of their way to pretend like they had no history here? And then why did the White House think that it was totally appropriate to shut down and censor discussions in social media and anywhere else? It paints, I think, a very, very troubling picture. And again, Fauci is at the heart of it.
Fauci is was until his retirement, the longest serving head of an agency in the U.S. government. The longest serving, 41 years he served as head of the National Institute for NIAID.
Yeah.
Okay, whatever it's called. Anyway,
allergies and infectious disease. Yeah.
Okay, not only was the highest paid person in the government, and due to the fact that he had been there for so long, but to call this guy a genius bureaucratic player would be to understate the case by a factor of 1,000. He knew everything. He was responsible. His agency was responsible for the disposition of billions of dollars a year in federal grants.
And that just to interrupt, that's important to what Jim was saying earlier, because a lot of the people with the Proximal Origins paper who instantly fell into line behind what Fauci and Francis Collins were saying were dependent on Fauci for doling out those grants. That is their lifeblood in their research. And so they need that money. And he had a hand in picking who got it.
And the idea that he didn't know what EcoHealth Alliance, which is the single most important NGO in this field on the planet Earth, was doing, beggars all belief. It cannot be. That would be like, me not knowing what AIPAC is doing, or, I don't know what the proper analogy would be, but of course,
or what your own authors are doing. I mean, he signed these grants.
Yeah. Yes.
These grants.
Yeah. Now, granted, yes.
I just want to also add, I think one of the reasons why he was protected for as long as he was, and why there's a lot of dissembling now, particularly among the Democrats about not kind of holding him to full account, is that he was made a cultural saint very early on. He filled that leadership vacuum that Trump really wasn't filling. There were all the signs. I mean, I live in a very blue city, and there were signs praising Fauci. I think if he's the longest serving federal agency official, he's probably also one of the few who appeared in Style magazine poolside with his sunglasses on, and who is going to make a fortune on his memoir. I mean, these are all things we hold up. He's a bureaucrat. Why are we canonizing a bureaucrat?
Right.
And every night, Gretchen Wilson went to sleep with her Fauci pillow, didn't she?
Yeah. By the way, the other important point to be made here is, though, that people were held to account. I mean, Andrew Cuomo was ended as the governor of New York, not because of his behavior on COVID nominally, but because of, a sex scandal that was no sex scandal. In fact, the reason that he was vulnerable and that he was forced to resign really is because the reckoning, this was the, I don't know what you call it, the sort of screwball off-point reckoning for his behavior during COVID. That's why others have paid. Fauci is the decision of Democrats in the House to close ranks behind Fauci during that hearing was very interesting and very telling. And I wonder, if it were 2025 and Biden had been reelected and this hearing were taking place in 2025, whether they would go after him like with hammer and tongs the way the Republicans did. That this remains Fauci versus Trump. This is our guy was good, your guy was bad. Our guy was
our
sane,
guy is
your
science.
guy was insane.
Our guy is
Our
science.
guy is science. Your guy is mystical authoritarianism, whatever. And that this narrative they cannot get away from.
Can I ask a question? Not to put Jim, not to put you on the spot, but because you were talking about it, I'm genuinely curious. What is the record of gain of function research in terms of, coming up with ways to prevent new virus? Have we broken through on viruses and things like that in the past? Has it served the public to get ahead of things and save lives? How do we understand what benefit, if we can understand the benefit, we've actually gotten over the years from this research?
That is such a good question. As far as I know, no benefit. Certainly, there's never been a vaccine created, in anticipation of a future epidemic based on this research. That's why Richard Ebright and other experts are arguing that these programs need to be shut down. In fact, we need some better global rules against the proliferation of these kinds of laboratories, because it's getting easier and easier to manipulate viruses. So, this is a real potential threat. And as bad as it was, COVID wasn't that, its fatality rate wasn't that high compared to MERS and some other diseases, which thankfully are not as transmissible. So this is a real threat. And even if there was a small benefit, or potentially even a large benefit, I think that weighing, it's a little bit like the famous trolley problem in philosophy. Like, do you really want to take the risk that you're taking an action today that has the potential to kill a lot of people on the theory that it could save an even bigger number? I think we're kind of playing with fire there. So I think that the argument for this gain of function research is extremely weak, especially now that we see how. I'm at this point, I'm like 98% convinced that this was a lab leak. It's always possible that could be proven wrong. We don't have the open and shut evidence, but we have no evidence that it came from the wet market. No good evidence. So I think if we look at the history of what happened here, we should be learning a really important lesson about science conducted partially in secrecy, and about this kind of global NGO network of scientific research presided over by people who are in positions of authority for far, far too long. They are far too invulnerable. I'm talking about Fauci here. No one should be running a major agency and distributing grant money for that long in science or any other field, because they become too invulnerable. And I think science itself suffers, and the whole world paid the consequence for it in this case.
I want to quickly make the point that if this were the result of a woman eating a bat in a market, and that somehow from this one strange moment, this thing exuded that started killing people and then killed people in the millions, and that the result of it was so quick because it happened sometime in the late fall to early winter of 2019, I don't think the Chinese would have been soldering people into their apartments and sealing them in their apartments and having flashing red lights on their phones if they walked more than 500 yards away from their homes. That seems like they knew that something terrible had happened definitively, and that it was scarier than we could possibly imagine, and that they better bite down on it, or that it was going to be, a version
so
of
right.
I Am Legend.
And even before they started doing that, they started erecting like makeshift hospitals, like every day.
Yeah.
Early on.
Yeah. So anyway, in other words, that's some circumstantial evidence that we don't really talk about very much. Yeah, they're a totalitarian, authoritarian system. Nobody's going around creating new Secret Service jobs to literally make it impossible for people to walk out their doors because they have no idea what they've let loose upon the world. We may have let loose something upon the world and on our own people. We better take extreme measures instantly. You don't do instantly from a kind of pervading, slowly, thing that starts reading. That just doesn't add up. You know what also doesn't add up? A world in which we start treating work as though it is a necessary evil rather than one of the things that allows us to express our God-given capacity to make the most out of what we are given and to make our mark upon the world and to increase productivity and to enhance the lives of everybody else. That's the subject of our friend David Bahnsen's book, Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. Because whether in public policy, in the culture, or even in religious bodies, too often work is seen as a necessary evil and not the universal blessing that it is. David argues for the economic, theological, and ontological significance of work. It is core to our identity, and the fastest way to a failed society is to continue in this low regard for work that ignores our God-given capacity for productivity. This is an argument, fresh, new, inventive, but with the oldest of echoes. Please go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, buy David Bahnsen's Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. That's BAHNSAN. Or to find out more, go to fulltimebook.com. I think we have to, we're pressing up against time here, but I think we have to make note of a couple of things over the last 24 hours. There is a kind of exhibit show. It's hard to describe what it is in downtown Manhattan, dedicated to the Nova Music Festival massacre on October 7th. That was where the paragliders came in, where the majority of the Israelis killed and wounded were shot and killed by the Hamasniks who came through the fences and on the paragliders and others. And this exhibit attempts to give you a sense of what it might have been like on that day. And yesterday, here in New York, what was called a Day of Rage for Gaza, there was a demonstration, hundreds of people outside the entrance to the Nova Massacre Memorial event, of people all masked, all wearing keffiyehs, all wearing Palestinian flags, all again looking for all the world to see, as though New York City's Lower Manhattan was Kabul in 1989 rather than New York City in 2024, screaming things like "Long live the Intifada," "Death to America." Having a music festival next to Gaza would be like having a concert next to Auschwitz. This was a genocidal music festival, effectively in support of the killing at the Nova Music Festival. This is now what has gone from implicit, has now gone entirely explicit. We had a physical attack on a Chabad rabbi at UCLA last night who was physically assaulted by protesters who then started calling him a pedophile rabbi and said things like Hitler should have done away with all of you. Everything is sort of, doors are opening. And at the same time, if I can just quickly read from Jewish Insider, if I can find it, I mentioned this yesterday, but the response of the Biden White House and the Biden administration to what on earth has been going on is so astounding. Just listen to this. This is what happened Sunday and Monday after the demonstrations in Lafayette Park and right outside the White House. Those protesters are exercising their right, and that is their right to do, said campaign spokesperson Adrienne Elrod. That is her response to people screaming, death to America, death to Israel, Intifada forever, lighting American flags on fire, and displaying posters of Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, looking like a vampire with blood dripping from his mouth. White House Deputy Press Secretary Andrew Bates, I'm now quoting from Gabby Deutsch's report in Jewish Insider, echoed that sentiment while suggesting, though not outright saying, that the president condemns the protesters. Quote, President Biden has been clear that every American has the right to peacefully express their views. But he has also been clear that anti-Semitism, violent rhetoric, and endorsing murderous terrorist organizations like Hamas is repugnant, dangerous, and against everything we stand for in the country. National Park Service officials were assaulted and injured, Bates said. So they were assaulted and injured. No arrests were made. National Park Service officials were sent into the park to protect the monuments and things, were beaten up. No arrests were made. You know why? Because they were told not to arrest anybody. That's why. Yes, we allow a right to protest. We do not allow cops to get beaten up. And we're allowing cops to get beaten up. And I cannot... we are, as I said, everything that was subtext is no longer subtext. And, it's like, it's not crystal knocked because Jewish businesses aren't specifically being targeted and destroyed and taken over and people thrown into, smaller and smaller apartments. It is not crystal knocked. It is not the 1930s in Germany. It's its own thing. And it's in America. And the president of the United States isn't doing anything about it. And I believe that the American people are going to do something about him if he doesn't start doing something about this. And I'm not saying this as a Jew. I'm saying this as an American and thinking about what Americans see, if they're seeing it. Because for all I know, they're not seeing it at all.
Well, the news reports
are suppressing it.
Well, the news reports talked about it as a pro-Palestinian protest without mentioning any of the anti-Semitism, the Hamas-wearing brigades of people praising Hamas. They just edit out the stuff that makes it what it is, which is a radical support of a terrorist organization and calls for the death of Jews.
I just want to say also, it's not staying the same. It's getting worse, and it's going to get worse. They were out there at Lafayette Park calling for jihad. They had what was meant to be the bloody head of the president. They were walking around with a Biden mask that was, with fake blood on it. They were out last night in New York with Hezbollah signs, Hamas headgear, the works. It's getting worse. It is going to get worse because nothing is being done about it. Because everyone is told to stand down in response to it.
I don't understand what is going on in the minds of the people who work at the Biden White House. I don't understand what they think they're doing by keeping quiet about this. This is the death of this administration. Implicitly allowing this behavior is the death of this administration. I can't say he's at 37% in the polls. How is he going to rise to 44% in the polls if he is letting people wander around the major cities of the United States praising terrorist groups and dressing like they're about to take over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran?
And here's my question. The people who are vandalizing statues in Lafayette Park, no matter how the Biden administration responds, the people doing the vandalizing are not voting for Joe Biden. Right? So what is the risk that they say? Who do they believe they're alienating if they were to crack down on people who are destroying American monuments and things like that? That's the question, is that they're not negotiating over the votes with the people out there. If they arrest these people's votes haven't changed.
Right.
So
you said something important. You said something important yesterday that I want to bring up, which is, like, I think There is now a Charlottesville every day in the United States. There is a Charlottesville every day in the United States. When Charlottesville happened in 2017, we went nuts. The entire political system went nuts. People yelled at Trump. His numbers went down to 30, 32, 33% because he said there are fine people on both sides. Saying it is their right to protest is not all that different from saying there are fine people on both sides. I'm sorry. If you and Joe Biden supposedly ran for president because he was so horrified by Charlottesville, well, lose the presidency. Go lose it because you treat this like it's not the same. If that got you elected president, this is going to get you unelected president in about 5 minutes. You're standing there at Juneteenth celebrations, standing still, frozen in place. You're trying to sit down on chairs that aren't there. You are speaking in incomprehensible sentences 3 times a day. So you know what? Do something to save yourself by doing something right instead of something cowardly and pernicious and low and cheap. You know it's wrong. Everyone in that White House knows it's wrong. Or maybe they don't. I don't know. There's the Deputy National Security Advisor who I think supports Hamas. So yeah, there are people inside who are opening a mouth like this. But I'm getting to the point where it's like, go ahead, lose. Really, go ahead. See if I care. Go ahead and lose. You got 5 more months. You're doing a bang-up job of losing this election the way Carter lost to Reagan. Sei gesund to you, and my congratulations. Okay, does anyone have a recommendation? Because I have one. Since we didn't parcel it out. Okay, go ahead.
All right, I want to recommend the Netflix show Tires. It is Shane Gillis's show about. It's in sitcom form about a bunch of guys who work in an automotive shop, and the show is actually about nothing in particular. It doesn't have much, if any, plot, although it has a sort of just to have one. It doesn't have much in the way of character development. It doesn't have a lot to explain except that it's wickedly funny. It's just, Shane Gillis he's the stand-up comic and podcaster. And a lot of times over the years, stand-up comedians have tried to make that transition into the TV show world. And in the past, before streaming, it was very hard to do this because you had to convince a studio that you could launch, at least a full season that would be watched by people on, say, NBC. And in the streaming world, there's a bit more experimentation, especially these days with Netflix, and it's extremely funny. It's just a lot of laughs. It's just a bunch of guys who work in a car shop and just kind of crack jokes and muddle their way through a life where they don't seem to be going anywhere. There's no drama about the show at all. It's just a funny and kind of a throwback to shows that were just completely reliant on the writing and the dialogue rather than literally anything else.
Can I say one important thing about this that connects to our Friday show with Eli when we talked about the decline of the media and why people don't pay attention to it and why no one should read newspapers and all of that? Shane Gillis first came to prominence because of a firing. I mean, he was hired to be a cast member on SNL in 2018 or 2019, and then some jealous person in the world of comedy went back through his Twitter or something and found 3 or 4 offensive tweets, or what were considered offensive tweets at the time. And NBC panicked and fired him 24 hours after he had been announced as a new cast member of Saturday Night Live, which of course is the be-all and end-all position. You become a cast member, you instantly your career is made, right? No, well, a lot of cast members on SNL. My wife worked in SNL for a long time. and has represented people at SNL and all that. And of course, you then have 6 or 7 people who never pop, who don't do anything, and they stand there for a year holding a spear and a sketch about Romans, or they say, "Hey, Phil," and that's all they do, and they're not on for 5 weeks or 6 weeks. And that likely would have been Sean Gillis's fate, in my view, because he's not really a character person or an impersonator or anything like that. Instead, he went back, he didn't get cast. He then became the single most successful stand-up in the United States by some reckonings, certainly of his age. He then returned to SNL, he went to SNL for the first time as host of the show in the past year, and then started this YouTube sitcom called Tires that is now a big show on Netflix. And had he done the mainstream media path and been the cast member on SNL who didn't really make it, none of this would have happened to him. It was a blessing in disguise. Don't take the path best traveled if you are an unconventional person with unconventional politics, and an unconventional, in the terms of the mainstream media, and an unconventional social perspective that is respectful of America instead of garbaging America. Maybe you're better off taking this like DIY path that Sean Gillis has taken to what could be one of the longest and most successful show business careers of anybody of his age. We'll see where he is in 2070, long after I'm dead. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Jim Meigs, as always, unbelievably informative and interesting and insightful and deep. And please, when we get our issue up, which I think will probably be Friday because we have the holiday intervening, and it is a corker of a double issue, summer issue, our July-August issue. I mean, the riches there are untold, and we will start telling you about them when we get back on Friday. But his piece, The Fauci Conspiracy, is a summa. Hopefully, we won't have to write another piece about COVID, but, we probably will. We keep thinking we're never going to have to do another one, and then they pull us back in. Anyway, Jim, thank you so much. And for Abe, Seth, and Christine, I'm John Podhoretz. Keep the candle burning.